All right, we are continuing tonight in our series in Isaiah. We're on chapter 30 now. And has anyone here ever tried rappelling before, where you're going down a rock face on a rope? I love this picture because here's this guy hanging out, dependent only on this rope, right? And he's got this big smile on his face. He's happy. He's dependent on that rope, but it's okay, right? Because he believes that rope is going to hold him. And the truth is that we all need, in the course of everyday life, to depend on a lot of people and a lot of things outside of ourselves. You know, as Christians, of course, we talk about depending on God or trusting in God, but think about it, even apart from God, we all are dependent on money, aren't we? Anybody able to buy groceries without money? Or pay your rent without money? We're dependent on our jobs to provide money. We're dependent on education for our jobs and to do the things that we do. We're dependent on our teachers, whether that's at a school or our parents in a homeschooling situation. We're dependent on schools. We're dependent on curriculum. We're dependent on doctors when we get sick. We're dependent on family and friends, especially when times are difficult. We're dependent on transportation, whether you have your own car or whether you're dependent on public transportation. We all depend on transportation to get places. We depend on stores so we can buy our food, so we can buy our clothes. We depend on governments to provide roads and electricity and water. We depend on police to provide protection. You know, this is normal, natural. This is the way God designed society, that we're all dependent on lots of people and lots of things outside of ourselves. But in Jeremiah 17:5 it says, "Cursed is the man who trusts in man and makes flesh his strength, whose heart turns away from the Lord." Does that mean it's wrong to trust in all these things, to trust in all these other people? Or we could maybe rephrase the question, when does it become wrong to trust to trust things other than God? At what point do we go over the line? At what point do we become the one who is cursed? Right? So that's a question that we want to answer as we go through Isaiah 30 tonight. Just to kind of review where we're at, we're in the fourth major section of Isaiah, these 12 chapters that reflect God as the Lord of history. And as we get into some of these later chapters, that title will become even more clear. To review where we're at, here's Isaiah's world of these 12 chapters. He's in this little tiny country of Judah, in the city of Jerusalem. That's where he's writing from. And you've got this huge empire of the day, Assyria, that is conquering all these other countries. And two other countries that are important in these 12 chapters are Egypt and Babylon. And with Assyria on the horizon, the big question in the people of Judah's mind in Isaiah's day is, who is going to protect us from Assyria? Humanly speaking, there's no way we can make it. We've got to find someone to protect us. But that wasn't God's concern. You'll see in this chapter that God's concern is actually glorifying His name among the nations. He's got the Assyria problem figured out. He's not worried about that one. The time period of these 12 chapters, now in Isaiah, the time period is not always clear. It can be difficult to figure out exactly when it's happening, but a big event that happened in Isaiah's life is in 701 BC, Assyria invaded Judah and conquered basically all of it. And most likely the time frame of these 12 chapters is in the years, even the year or two right before this happened. So that's kind of the Isaiah's context that he's writing in. That's what's on people's minds. Okay, we know what's on our minds, the political situation of the day. This is what was on their minds, all right? Assyria's coming. So Isaiah 30 can be divided into four basic sections. We have this sinful alliance that God is talking about. And then he describes the rebellion of his people. That's the first half of the chapter. Then the next half of the chapter, God is going to help us or help them understand why he's trustworthy. And he's going to talk about how he's trustworthy in the ultimate future and also in the near future. So that's where we're going with this. So we'll start with verse 1 here. Ah, stubborn children, declares the Lord, who carry out a plan but not mine, who make an alliance but not of my spirit, that they may add sin to sin, who set out to go down to Egypt without asking for my direction, to take refuge in the protection of Pharaoh, and to seek shelter in the shadow of Egypt. Well, the question we should ask ourselves first is, what's going on? What's Isaiah describing here? Well, what he's describing is the people of Judah are afraid. They're afraid of Assyria. They're trying to figure out, how do we stay safe? And they came up with this great plan. Let's go down to Egypt and let's hire them to protect us. Okay? Now, why is that wrong? In Isaiah's day, that was the way to stay. In fact, even in our day today, that's the way to stay safe. If you're a small nation, you make an alliance with a big nation, that's how you stay safe. Right? Normal, natural. Why is it wrong? Why was it wrong for the people of Judah? Well, God tells us here what was on his mind. They carry out a plan, but not mine. They make an alliance, but not of my spirit. In other words, they're making their plans and carrying them out without consulting God, without checking, is this what you want us to do, God? So that's the first thing. Then we have down here to take refuge in the protection of Pharaoh. So basically, these people are seeking refuge in a person other than God. They're choosing to trust in Egypt and in Pharaoh instead of trusting in God. So we have these two reasons. We'll just summarize them and then add a third here. So the first thing that was wrong was the sin of self-reliance. That they were carrying out plans without consulting God. They thought they were smart. They thought they could figure life out, and they were going forward with that. Then we have the sin of idolatry. And we'll talk a little bit later about why this is called the sin of idolatry. But when they were seeking refuge and protection in someone instead of God, they were depending on this thing instead of God. And when we depend on something instead of God, we're making that our idol. But there was also a third reason, and it's not apparent in this chapter, but in the book of Deuteronomy in 17:16, God had specifically told the people of Israel, after he brought them out of Egypt, okay, I've brought you out of Egypt, that was the place of bondage, do not go back there. Well, what are they doing? They're going back there. So they're specifically disobeying that command of God. So there are all three of these things going on here. And so if we just continue, God says, therefore shall the protection of Pharaoh turn to your shame, and the shelter in the shadow of Egypt to your humiliation. For though his officials are at Zoan and his envoys reach Hanes, everyone comes to shame through a people that cannot profit them, that brings neither help nor profit, but shame and disgrace. So God says, okay, go to Egypt, try your thing, but I'm just telling you right now, it's going to fail. It's not my plan. It's going to fail. And then verses 6 and 7, God begins to essentially mock them for what they're doing. Listen to what he says. An oracle on the beasts of the Negeb. The Negeb is the wilderness area between Judah and Egypt. Through a land of trouble and anguish, from where come the lioness and the lion, the adder and the flying fiery serpent. God's describing the Negeb there. Okay, going through this difficult land. They carry their riches on the backs of donkeys and their treasures on the humps of camels to a people that cannot profit them. Egypt's help is worthless and empty. Therefore, I've called her Rahab, who sits still. Okay, this is a picture of the people of Judah putting their riches, their treasures on the backs of camels and donkeys, and probably literally this was happening, and traveling through this wilderness to get down to Egypt. And God is saying, you're going to all this trouble, but Egypt is worse than worthless. You're not going to get help there. So that's the sinful alliance that God is describing. And now he goes on to talk about the people of Judah. And he tells Isaiah Now go write before them on a tablet, inscribe it in a book, that it may be for the time to come as a witness forever. For they are, three things: a rebellious people, lying children unwilling to hear the instruction of the Lord. Rebellious people. You know, we can sit here 2,700 years later and say these crazy people, why didn't they trust God? Why were they coming up with this crazy idea of going down to Egypt for help? Just do what God wants you to do and things will be okay. But think about it. They were simply doing what was reasonable for any other country in their day. And we do that all the time, right? In our Western culture, everyone expects that we pay for our retirement by investing money. And we trust in those investments for retirement. Everybody knows in our culture that we trust in health insurance to pay for our medical expenses. Or we trust in lawyers, we trust in doctors for our health. All sorts of things that are just normal, natural for us today. So they were just doing what felt normal. It's just that wasn't what God wanted them to do. But then he says they're lying children. He wasn't talking about the fact that they were telling lies. Basically, it's the idea that they were disappointing. They were failing to be what they ought to be. God had called them to be a special nation, to represent him in front of all the other nations, to show all the other nations how powerful God is and what it's like to live in faith and trust in God. He says they're failing in that. They're not doing it. Children unwilling to hear the instruction of the Lord. These people were convinced that they knew better for God how to handle their lives, how to manage their lives. You know anyone who thinks that maybe they know how to manage their life better than God? I've certainly been there. These people say to the seers, do not see, and to the prophets, do not prophesy to us what is right. Speak to us smooth things, prophesy illusions, leave the way, turn aside from the path. Let us hear no more about the Holy One of Israel. Now, I don't think these people were actually saying prophesy illusions, right? But Isaiah's telling them, this is what you really are like. So basically, if you remember, we've talked about this was a very religious people. Their religious systems and programs were going full speed, but they just didn't want God to interfere. They didn't want God to tell them how to run their religious systems and how to trust him. They were just fine with the way things were. And if we drop down a few verses to verse 15, thus said the Lord God, the Holy One of Israel, in returning and rest you shall be saved, in quietness and in trust shall be your strength. But you were unwilling. What was God asking of them? If you look at this verse, how was God asking them to respond to the Assyrian crisis? Go out and fight? Returning. That word can also be translated repentance. It's the same word. Rest. You should be saved. In quietness and trust shall be your strength. You don't need to do anything, God says. I've got this handled. This is under control. You do not need to worry about it. You do not need to go out and do anything. You need to repent, and you need to trust me. Think about it. Would you do that? You know, this was not a new message. He says, thus said the Lord, that's past tense. God has told them this in the past. About 30 years before, Isaiah, this is back in Isaiah chapter 7, God says to Isaiah, go to King Ahaz and give him this message. Be careful, be quiet, do not fear, do not let your heart be faint. Does that sound familiar? That was when another army was coming in. But basically for 30 plus years, Isaiah has been giving them this message. You don't need to worry about these other armies. God has got things under control. God has got your back. What you need to do is trust him. But they were unwilling. But let's think about their context. Why were they unwilling? I mean, let's go back to this picture. Look at the size of Judah compared to the size of Assyria. Is there any reason, humanly speaking, why they should expect to be able to defeat Assyria? No. This was radical trust that God was calling them to. But God says, I want you to do it, and I'm going to do my part. Why were they unwilling to do it? Well, they said, no, we will flee upon horses, therefore you shall flee away. We will ride upon swift steeds, therefore your pursuers shall be swift. Basically, these people were terrified, which was a reasonable emotion to feel when Assyria is coming. Assyria has an undefeated record, right? They had defeated all the cities that they had attacked. There was no reason to believe, humanly speaking, that anything different was going to happen with Judah or with Jerusalem. So they were terrified, but they thought they could do a better job protecting themselves than God could. So God says, okay, you can flee away on your fast horses, but your enemy's going to be faster. Swift steeds, your pursuers shall be swift. 1,000 of you shall flee at one, at the threat of 5, you shall flee. Now, what's going on here? God says, and by the way, I'm going to be on the side of your enemy. I'm going to be working against you, and 1,000 of you are going to flee at the threat of 5. These people were actually causing God to have to work against them. It wasn't what God wanted to do. But God said, no, I have to work against you because you're working against me. So we have this sinful alliance, we have a rebellious people, but now God is going to take the rest of the chapter and He's going to remind them who He is, and He's going to remind them why they can trust Him. And He's going to do this 2 ways. First of all, the ultimate future. And here we have the little guy looking through his telescope to remind us that now Isaiah is looking off into the future. Because if you remember, we've talked about in Isaiah, he's constantly bouncing back and forth between the present and the future. And so we just put these little symbols in here to remind ourselves that he's talking about the future now. And first, verse 18 is a verse that transitions from the first half of the chapter to the second. Therefore, the Lord waits to be gracious to you. Therefore, He exalts Himself to show mercy to you. For the Lord is a God of justice. Blessed are all those who wait for Him. This is a beautiful verse. Therefore, the Lord waits to be gracious to you. What is this saying? Therefore is a transitionary word. What came right before this? You are a rebellious people. Therefore, I have to wait to be gracious to you. God is saying, because of your rebellion, I have to wait. I want to be gracious to you. I want to bless you. I want to give you what you want. But I can't right now. I have to wait because of your rebellion. And then we go into this description of future times. For a people shall dwell in Zion, in Jerusalem you shall weep no more. He will surely be gracious to you at the sound of your cry. As soon as He hears it, He answers you. Though the Lord give you the bread of adversity and the water of affliction, yet your teacher will not hide himself anymore. Your eyes shall see your teacher. Your ears shall hear a word behind you saying, this is the way, walk in it. When you turn to the right or when you turn to the left. So if we just look at some of these phrases, this is a time when you will weep no more. This is a time when as soon as God hears your prayers, He's right there answering it. This is a time when your eyes shall see your teacher. Who's that? I believe that's probably Jesus. Your ears shall see a word behind you saying, this is the way, walk in it. He's talking about a time of spiritual renewal. He's talking about restoration when our relationship with God is restored. He's talking about when we have restored spiritual sight and spiritual hearing. We don't have time to go in detail through all these verses, but verses 22 through 26 talk about them destroying their idols because they've realized that's not the answer anymore. He talks about restoration and restored nature and the blessing of nature and the blessing of animals. He even talks about the sun being 7 times brighter than normal. He talks about how he's going to get the ultimate victory. So these verses give a promise of this restoration that's going to happen sometime in the future. And Isaiah doesn't say when, but it's off in the future. And he says, you can look forward to this time. But why, in the middle of this chapter, do we have this sudden description of this period of restoration? I think it's because God is saying, you can trust me. I've got things under control, and the end is already all worked out. I am going to fulfill my promises. And God had given them many, many promises, just as He's given us many promises. God was reminding them He is sovereign. That means He's in control. His purposes will not be frustrated. Even though those people of Judah were being unfaithful to God and not trusting in Him, God is saying, my purposes are still going to happen. And then we go into verses 27 to 33, where we come back now to Isaiah's day. So we got the little guy looking through the microscope to remind us that now we're back in Isaiah's day. Behold, the name of the Lord comes from afar, burning with his anger and in thick rising smoke. His lips are full of fury. His tongue is like a devouring fire. His breath is like an overflowing stream that reaches up to the neck, to sift the nations with the sieve of destruction, to place on the jaws of the peoples a bridle that leads astray. This is a very poetic, very pictorial picture of God. And what is happening here? Well, when we get down to verse 31, you're going to see that he's talking about God's defeat of the Assyrian army. But these verses are a colorful and poetic description of God defeating the Assyrians. And then look at the language he uses, that God is burning in anger, thick rising smoke, his tongue is like a devouring fire. This language is meant to try to get their attention. And remember, these are the people of Judah. These are the people who came out of Egypt. And Isaiah's using Exodus-type language of burning anger and thick rising smoke and fire. Remember God on Mount Sinai when he was in the fire and the smoke and the people were terrified of him? So Isaiah is reminding these people that the God who was faithful to you in the past is the same God who's taking care of this today. Verse 28, his breath is like an overflowing stream that reaches up to the neck. This is exactly how God describes the invasion of the Assyrians in chapter 8. Now he's using it to describe the defeat of the Assyrians in chapter 30. You shall have a song as in the night when a holy feast is kept, and gladness of heart as when one sets out to the sound of the flute to go to the mountain of the Lord, to the rock of Israel. He's talking about a triumphal procession here, like going to a festival or a feast. Why would he talk about that? Well, he's giving the picture that the people of God, while God does his work of judgment, the people of God are singing his praises. We can find this again in Revelation 19. When God is defeating his ultimate enemies, the people of God are singing the praises of God. The Lord will cause his majestic voice to be heard, the descending blow of his arm to be seen, in furious anger and a flame of devouring fire, with a cloudburst and storm and hailstones. All these word pictures of who God is, his voice and his arm and his anger, and then using all these pictures from nature, fire, clouds, storm, hailstones. Isaiah is just trying to paint a very graphic picture of God on the move. God is coming. He will do his job. And then we get to verse 31 where we find out what God's doing. The Assyrians will be terror-stricken at the voice of the Lord when he strikes with his rod. And then listen to this. And every stroke of the appointed staff that the Lord lays on them will be to the sound of tambourines and lyres. So again, you have the picture of the people of God singing and praising as God defeats his enemies. Battling with brandished arm, he will fight with them. Then the last verse of the chapter, a burning place has long been prepared. Indeed, for the king it is made ready, its pyre made deep and wide. What is a pyre? A funeral pyre is a fire to burn the dead body. Right? Someone dies. If you have a funeral pyre, that means you're burning the body. And who's getting burned? The king of Assyria. With fire and wood in abundance, the breath of the Lord like a stream of sulfur kindles it. In other words, this king of Assyria is marching to his own funeral pyre. That's what God is saying. Now, if you read the story in a couple chapters, in chapters 36 and 37, you know that this isn't actually the picture of how God defeated the Assyrians. Actually, what happened is he went out in the middle of the night and just killed them all. People got up the next morning and figured out what was going on. So why would God use all of this colorful, poetic description to describe God on the move? Again, I think it's to get their attention. Get the people's attention. And you'll see this is common in the New Testament. Even David describes God on the move in all of these terms like this. But again, I think God is giving them the same message. I can be trusted. I am on the move. I've got this in hand. I don't need your help to defeat the Assyrians. I will do it with my mighty arm. His purposes will be accomplished not just in long-term history, but in this specific challenge. Think about us today. We might say, I trust God for my eternal salvation. Sure, He's got that taken care of. But I'm not sure I can trust Him for my health today. I'm not sure I can trust Him to provide the finances I need. I'm not sure I can trust Him to pay for all of these expenses or for, to get the right education or to get the right job or all these other things. Right? Sometimes it's harder to trust God at the moment than it is to trust Him for our eternal salvation. But God says, no, I've got the future taken care of, but you're going to see in about a year or two, I'm also taking care of the present. So that's a quick run through of Isaiah 30, but we need to finish with asking, how does it relate to us today? What can we learn from this? And I'd like to go back to the two reasons from this chapter why it was wrong for Judah to trust in Egypt or to go down to Egypt, this idea of self-reliance and idolatry. Well, first of all, self-reliance. Why is it wrong? We can say, God has given me a mind. He's given me the ability to think through, to reason, to make my plans. I should be able to do it, right? The problem is that when we don't consult God, we can end up working against His purposes. And that puts us against God, and therefore God against us. For example, in Jeremiah 13:11, God says, I made the whole house of Israel and the whole house of Judah cling to me, declares the Lord. What's He saying? I put them in tough situations, so they had to cling to me. Situations that were beyond them, that were too hard for them, they had to cling to me. And why did God put them in those situations? That they might be for me a people, a name, a praise, and a glory, but they would not listen. Why was God putting them in these difficult situations that forced them to cling to Him? Because it was His purpose to use them to show all the other nations what a great God He was, to bring praise and glory to His name. That's what He wanted. That was His purpose. But when they chose to go to Egypt for help, if Egypt had defeated the Assyrians, God wouldn't have gotten the glory. They were trying to go around God's purposes, and so of course God's going to work against them. So self-reliance is wrong because if we don't consult God, we can end up working against His purposes. Idolatry. Why do I call this idolatry, this idea of going down to Egypt? Well, the idea is when we trust in anything or anyone instead of in God, we end up worshiping that. That's why we call it idolatry. And we go back to this verse in Jeremiah 17:5. Thus says the Lord, cursed is the man who trusts in man and makes flesh his strength, whose heart turns away from the Lord. That's the key. It's something that's turning your heart away from God. What did Jesus say? He said, where your treasure is, there your heart will be also. Right? So you're going to end up worshiping what your treasure is. And so now we're back to the question that we started with. When does it become wrong to trust things other than God? When do we cross the line and we've gone too far? We're trusting in people too much. We're trusting in money too much. When do we cross that line? I would say we cross that line when it becomes something that we can't give up. That if God asks you to give up that money, or give up that health insurance, or give up that job, or give up that chance at an education, or give up whatever, give up that relationship. If you can't give it up, that means you're trusting in it too much. And the classic example would be the rich young ruler who came to Jesus and says, what do I do to get to heaven? Jesus said, well, you know the law of Moses. What does it say? And the guy lists all these commandments, and Jesus said, well, go do them. And the guy said, I've done them. What did Jesus say? He said, one thing you lack. Go sell everything you have, give it to the poor, and come and follow me. And the guy went away sad. Why? Because that's what he depended on. That was where his trust was. At the end of the day, that was what he thought could save him. He thought could be the answer for him, and he couldn't give it up. So, what in our lives would fit in that category? That it's too important to us that if God were to ask us to give it up, we couldn't do that. That's when it becomes an idol to us. God can be trusted. And He has called us to lives of radical trust, just like He was calling the people of Judah to trust Him radically in a situation that, humanly speaking, was impossible. God is calling us to radically trust Him as well. Not just for our salvation. Yes, He's asking us to trust Him for our salvation, but He's asking us to trust Him in everyday life. In these two areas that we've talked about, self-reliance and idolatry, He's called us to depend on Him constantly for guidance. Every day, going to Him and getting His perspective on our day and our plans. Trust in the Lord with all your heart, Proverbs 3:5-6 says, and lean not on your own understanding. In all your ways, acknowledge Him. So that's this idea of self-reliance. And then idolatry, we're depending on Him constantly as our primary source of protection and provision. This idea from Jeremiah 17:7, blessed is the man who trusts in the Lord. So, okay, I have health insurance, but I'm trusting God to use that to provide for me. And if I need to give it up, okay, I can give it up. I'm trusting God that this is a job He's provided today to meet my needs, but if He asks me to give it up tomorrow, I can walk away from it believing that He is going to provide for and protect me. And I want to close with this picture and ask, is this a picture of your life? If this rope is God, and God is the one holding you up, and your trust is completely in Him all day, every day, and it's not a terrible thing, it brings joy. There is no joy, there is no peace that can be experienced that is more powerful than the joy and peace that you will have when you recognize that you are safe in God's hands. So it's my prayer for all of us that as we go out this week and in the coming weeks, that this would be a reflection more and more of our lives, that we would be dependent more and more on God, and that we would experience more and more the joy and the peace of putting our life in His hands.